Welcome. My name is Romina Sperano, and I'm a medical localizer, actually. I came to plain language a little bit by accident and with a little skepticism. So if you're there, bear with me because it might fascinate you just as it did me, and it's an ongoing discovery. I was working on a website for a client, and I ended up working on the source text much more than on the translation. And somebody said, "Oh, you are writing in plain language." Like, no, what do you mean? Like that was controlled English or simple English Wikipedia? No, this is clear, you're following logic. So I started looking into it, and lo and behold, now I'm a member of the Plain Language Association International, and I think this is a movement that it's at the beginning, even though it's been really gaining traction for decades, it's a toddler, and we are going to make it grow together. As Wonder Woman is showing us in the slide, change is hard, but sometimes we really have to open our mind and embrace it. So today we are going to look at the journey of plain language to take readers from a state of confusion to a state of understanding. The process, we're going to look at the original texts that inspired plain language, the jargonese of government, corporate, and legal texts, what plain language started with, citizen access and consumer access, and what I like to call plain language 2.0. And this is going to be your baby. This is what you're going to be doing as writers in this next phase. Because plain language is no longer just using this simple term or the maxim, don't use passive voice. That is no longer the case. And we're using plain language to access diverse communities, to give it scaffolding for literacy, and to promote science communication, which in this day and age with technology and science everywhere, in every decision we make in our lives, we need the public, we need consumers, we need policymakers better informed. So we're going to take our hero's journey today of good writers fighting bad prose, and we're going to look at what plain language is, some of the strategies, and we're going to look at the 5 principles of plain language and some of the things you can do, some that are on a very visible level and some that are behind the scenes, that it's hard for writers to talk about, it's hard for clients and consumers to see, but they have to be there for the text to be clear. And then we're going to look at the heroes of our story and what motivated them to start this movement. So this is our 5 principles. Something that's also comes into play, which we were talking about in the presentation before with Jason Cobb that talked about the census, is we also need to take into account the iteration of including the reader and doing testing for revisions, but we're talking about writing. So in the audience, how do we write to our audience? The first visible aspect of it is consider your reader. Answer their questions, address their needs, their curiosity, their interests. But the behind the scenes aspect as a writer that you have to take into account is consider the reader's prior knowledge. And that's what being aware of the curse of knowledge is about. Don't assume they know. And I love this image that comes from a book called Overcoming Textbook Fatigue, because it's removed from us historically, and we can understand if we show this to a young millennial, they may say, okay, a bunch of men who are signing up for something. What if we show them what the title of the booth was. If they don't know the word suffrage, they're like, well, maybe, maybe they are the Elks and they don't want the women in their gym. But this is huge, right? And so by not knowing one contextual aspect of it, they cannot read into the subtleties. A modern example of taking into account that is the versioning of Wikipedia. Wikipedia has simple English Wikipedia targeted at children, people with disabilities, second language learners that may not want to go through the full-blown version of it for the general public. And they also give you links to specialized publications. So if you're a specialist looking at something that maybe is not in your field, but you're going to do a cross-disciplinary consultation or whatever, you can also find that. So we have versioning. That's another aspect of Plain Language 2.0 that I really like. A project I was personally involved in terms of giving people context is vaccination. Campaigns like Don't Wait, Vaccinate, or the vaccine can help you into adulthood were not working because people were telling us, I eat organic, so I don't need vaccination. So we wanted to appeal to their better angels, and so we worked with the concept of herd immunity, which is hard to explain, but we showed images like this, and we accessed parents through their children and said, we are holding the umbrellas so that the people who cannot hold the umbrellas, the immunodepressed people, are also protected. So don't do it for yourself, do it for the betterment of the community. And that worked. So sometimes you have to find that context that reaches the reader. In terms of purpose, first and foremost, lead with your topic. Start with your main idea. This is an example from an organization that does simple, plain language access materials for teenagers in India. And right away they will tell you, we were going to talk about sexuality, we were going to talk about personal relationships, we're going to talk about this or that. We're going to do a little exercise, and that's where the texts are for. I want you to read this text. This is similar to a study run by Bransford and Johnson on the importance of topic. So if you read the text, I want you to tell me at the end if you learned what you were supposed to learn. What are you doing with it? And I'm not telling you the topic. Yes, that's the text, and you also have it on your paper just in case this is not big enough or something. And if you know this text, you can go to the next one, which I'm going to display quickly. That's another option. I have a couple more right here. One more. Oh, yes. Right here. A couple more. There you go. There we go. So what is the text about? What did you learn? Anybody? What if I told you he's trying to teach you kite flying? Right? Yes, so lead with your topic. If you give your reader that first, it's like, that's what the bird poop was about. So you can do this one, and if you don't get to what this one is about later on, you thought you were going to come here and go and chill after, but this is homework. You can do this one, and if you're curious about, you can Google it, but you can also email me and we can talk about it. The behind-the-scenes aspect of purpose creates a clear destination. And sometimes you think with a map it's enough, but no, you want to really tell your reader this is how you're going to do it. So relevance is very important. How do we do this? We have to plan, we have to brainstorm. Mind maps are a great idea. These mind maps are from a group, a team in Australia that I love, and if you're looking for inspiration, go visit them, learning fundamentals. Let's say you're talking about climate change, global warming. What aspect are you going to really discuss? Are you going to go with energy saving? Are you going to go with plastic detoxification? Are you going to go into the science of global warming? Are you going to go and do a plea for people to start acting? You need to erase what's not relevant and focus on what is. In terms of flow, the first T on our up to the third power text, flow, organization. You want to organize your information. Break it up into bite-sized pieces so your readers will feel that there's access. If you present a wall of text, no matter how bright a sticky note, digital or real, you put on it, it will be a wall. And they will walk away and look for information somewhere else. So use headings, use white space, use lists when appropriate, and we're going to talk about lists versus visual aids later on, and make it presentable. This was actually an example from a project I worked on. The behind-the-scenes aspect of text flow, argument structure. Decide with your goal in mind what argument structure is going to work for your reader. Is it going to be a sequence, a timeline, cause and effect, question and answer, or hierarchy? If you're giving instructions such as this one, a sequence works great. If you are discussing a process, cause and effect works great. If you remember from my example about trying to get in touch with my congressman, the website was structured in a hierarchical way versus a Q&A. And this is actually an example that was presented at the Plain conference this September in Austria. The Social Security Administration in Portugal did exactly that. They saw lots of phone calls, lots of waste, really, answering questions on where to find information about access. And they redesigned the website so that people go into the page and click on these practical guides. And they will see guides for different services, dependent help, unemployment, and they're all structured in this way. I don't know if I have a pointer. Yes. They have what is this benefit, who is entitled to this benefit, how do I claim it? All of them. So if you happen to need two services, you're not trying to understand how they're explaining everything. You know that that's the structure you're going to get. Text content, which is my dear aspect. How do you write? When you hear quick fix advice about plain language, they will tell you write to your audience, write to your purpose, write effectively. How do we do that? What is writing effectively? First, at the sentence level, use grammar sense. When they tell you use active voice, take it with a grain of salt. Why? Because that usually means align your subject with your topic. The subject of your sentence is the topic of your sentence, so it makes sense to align it with the topic of your message. And that's why. It has nothing to do with being the agent of the action or process that is being talked about. My dog died, my dog didn't do anything. It wasn't an agent. It was a victim in a process. So if you have passive versus active. A reminder will be sent to the patient versus you will receive a reminder. The active voice may be great if you're speaking to the patient, but the passive voice may be great if you're training your staff. And this is a little bit of the grammar geek in me, showing you the spectrum of possibilities in English, and you may want to recreate this in your target languages. In English, we have this dance between active and passive voice, because in intransitive verbs, we have the subject, no problem. It's one argument, one entity being the subject. And the subject could be semantically a doer or semantically an object. And I like using these general terms, doer and done to get away from subject and object, agent and patient, because there's more to it. In transitive verbs, we cannot do that. If we say the storm destroyed the city, the doer is the storm. If we say the city destroyed the storm, the doer is still, is now the storm, the city, right? So the storm destroyed the city is one thing, the city destroyed the storm is completely different. So we need to go to passive voice to bring the city to subject position, to topic position, without making it the doer. The city was destroyed by the storm. So, these are technical terms if you are interested in grammar and linguistics. In defense of the passive voice, do consider it. Do not erase it from your writing tools. When the doer is unknown, do use it when it brings a new perspective to the done to. And I'm going to read this. Whole Foods, who packs a month's supply of food in a single grocery bag, was bought by Amazon, who ships a paperclip in a refrigerator box. That has an effect, right? And then this was sent to me by a friend who's trying to catch me up on This Is Us, a show that's going on, and it's a family that has triplets and adopts a baby. The baby, Jack, who's the husband, tells his wife, had been brought to the hospital by a fireman who had been dissuaded from adopting the child himself. So that passive at the end is heavy, but it gives a lot of information because it becomes the inspiration and the sign to this man that they have to adopt this baby. So in those situations, you really want to consider the passive. Another quick tip in plain language: avoid noun piling and garden paths when you misguide the reader. Why? What is behind this? Grammar is the best app ever. Better than any one that you can download. And it untangles a web of thoughts into a linear string. So we have a sequence, word after word, whether it's spoken or written. But that sequence is not without order. It's nested. And so we want to respect that nesting. We want to be aware of that nesting. Whether you think about your sentences in a tree structure or in a mamushka visualization, think about that when you write. I'm going to let you read these and tell me if you can read them easily. What's the problem here? Our eyes want to read Still Knives and Her Students as a unit. And so we have to go back, and these are studies about readability do this. They see how much the readers have to go back and reread. When Knives Are Made From is a unit instead, and Students Have the Maturity to Talk is another unit, right? So if we have that nesting and tree structure in our head, we can tell readers, we can guide readers through the right path. Name piling. If you want to, after this, in your homework session, Google the first noun piling phrase. It had lots of discussion on the internet. In science, very common. This is also where plain language 2.0 is helping scientists. We cannot do this, but it doesn't have to be that long to be crazy. My cable company sent me a buried, this was in a communication, a buried cable technician, and I was wondering, how is this guy from 6 Feet Under going to fix my TV? Going from the sentence level to the whole message, to the discourse, we want cohesion. Cohesion is the glue of language, of written language. The three elements of cohesion are markers, additive markers, contrastive markers, cause and effect, sequence markers like and, but, therefore, first, second, right? Referencing and concept families. And lo and behold, policemen have to write reports, and they have to write them in the third person. So the you situation that we were talking about earlier with, write always to your reader. They're not doing that. They're not supposed to do that. Referencing is a great technique for objective writing. So in the first one, when the suspect walked into the store, he was wearing a stocking mask. We have a good reference of this person. The he refers to the suspect. When he walked into the store, the suspect was wearing a stocking mask. If this is meant to mean the same person, we have a problem. So check your referencing and use concept families. Sometimes we do want repetition. Sometimes with using repetition, we lead the readers to think actually there are more than one entity with that concept. And then coherence, which is the hardest, most invisible aspect of writing. What is coherence? How do you make your message coherent? You provide logical progression. You give information that is given, and then you add the news to your reader. And the technical terms for these are theme and rhyme, or topic and news. But topic and news gets confused with the topic of the message, so I like theme and rhyme for this aspect. Three very effective ways of building logical progression is through linear progression, constant, or derived. What this means is we present a topic and we give news about it, and then we pick up those news and make it the topic of our next sentence and continue building. In constant, we're giving different pieces of information about the same topic. In a derived structure, let's say we're talking about, we're going to see an example, the peregrine falcon, the females, the males, the chicks. Those are derived topics about this that will help us feel that we are building a story. So an example, and you have the whole text in the handouts, text 1 and text 2. In a project, I had to argue for one of these two different texts about hurricanes to teach middle schoolers. A hurricane is a huge storm that swirls around a low-pressure center of mostly calm weather. The low-pressure center of the storm is known as the eye of the hurricane. So here we have a linear structure, and we pick up the news from one sentence and make it the topic of our next. In a derived example, in the eye of the storm, winds are light and precipitation low. Above the eye, skies are usually clear. Around the eye, a thick ring of towering thunderstorms form the wall of the hurricane. So all of these will tells you a story. It's not a narrative story, it's a visual story. It helps you understand the hurricane as a 3D entity. If you start telling people the hurricane is a huge storm, hurricanes rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. The center of the storm, or eye, is the calmest part. When they come to land, the heavy rain, strong winds, and large waves can damage buildings, trees, and cars. This was all sequential in a text. You're not learning anything, really, because it's spitting out facts that don't help you create a story. And these are the two texts that you can work with later. This does not mean that you can never deviate. You can. You just have to be careful and measure it. This is from an article in The Sun. The peregrine falcon was brought back to from the brink of extinction by a ban on DDT, but also by a peregrine falcon mating hat invented by an ornithologist at Cornell University. If you can't buy this, Google it. Female falcons had grown dangerously scarce, etc., etc. So you can wink to the reader, you can deviate, but you want to sprinkle that very conscientiously. Now we're going to go into text design, and this is the visual aspect of writing and organizing and presenting a final document. Catch your reader's eye. Yes. Use white space, use formatting, and use visuals. This is an example from Change People, which is an organization in the UK that produces material for people with learning disabilities. So they have very big titles, very short paragraphs, lots of visual aids. And in the aspect of visual aids, we want to use data visualization. How many of you have heard the term? It's incredible. It's an incredible field. Data journalism and data visualization, I think, is growing. It's incredible. And it's also bringing a little bit of the plain language concept into visuals, into images. That's why one of the reasons why we changed, we went from the food pyramid to the food plate. We can tilt tables so to make them more understandable. We learned them one way in math in 7th grade, but it doesn't mean that they always have to be like that. We want to expand statistics with visual aids for the public, and a lot of times use infographics to help with instructions. This is an instruction about no bathtub while your wound is healing. So we talked about what plain language is the finding, understanding, and using relevant information, and the strategies to create an apt text, working with the principles of audience, purpose, text flow, text content, and text design. For the audience, we want to tend to their needs and provide context. For the purpose, we want to lead with our topic and be relevant, give only the details that the readership needs. For the flow or organization, break it up into sections and use a logical or argumental structure that fits the purpose. Text content, be aware of your parsing, your grammar, so you avoid forking paths, you avoid piling, and the unwrapping of piling that is incredibly tedious. Use coherence. Build the logical progression of your text. So go back to it and see, are my sentences picking up where the last one left off? Are they creating a story? And text design, use formatting and data visualization to help your reader access the text. Why? Why do we do all this? One of the reasons lately, more and more research is showing that the brain processes different when we're reading than when we're hearing. All kinds of consequences from that. One of them is that's why, not only because we're using our eyes, but because our brain is using the visual sides of it to see things. We don't want to text and drive. That's why we can talk on the phone, or we can talk to our passenger, but we can't really text. The process of myelination, which is the covering with the fatty substance, the white matter of neurons, becomes, it's different with reading, and it happens at different times, and so the paths to that make us write different than what we speak. And even with fingered speech, which is a term that linguists are using for texting, the way people are texting, and now even a friend the other day texted what we were talking about, something about the school for our kids. Slash, are you going to, like, slash. Oh, by the way. And it's it is a different vocabulary, but I'm still reading. I'm still processing it with different parts of the brain. Subject matter is certainly an issue. The complexity of certain subject matters will call for different structures and different techniques. And plain language advocates have looked at and addressed issues that come from the obscurity of the writers and difficulties in the readership. The government, access to information, access to benefits, the legalese, and interestingly, there's a lot of studies that look at how lawyers and judges receive plain language. Originally, judges were more amenable. Lawyers are coming along, although in the conference in Graz, they showed a little more resistance, and we're going to look at some examples of how we can bridge that, because they want to protect every aspect. They want to cover every corner, even the ones that exist only in black holes. We want to use plain language in academia and science, and this is extremely important. The obscurity of science communication is incredible. Some because of egos, which happens. Some because they really don't know how to write. And we just need to say, okay, you know what? This is a skill. I'm an amazing researcher, but I don't know how to write. Help. Why not? And the difficulties from the readership stem from immigration and second language learning. We have limited schooling. We're going to look at some statistics about that, and people with learning disabilities. So this is a situation that sort of is a microcosm of everything. A judge says, the charge here is theft of frozen chickens. Are you the defendant? And the defendant proceeds to answer, no, sir, I'm the guy who stole the chickens. This comes from a court in California. And it seems like, okay, well, you know, the guy doesn't really need to know that he's the defendant. But in studies done about juror instructions, so the guy who stole the chickens can be called upon being a juror. They found that 50% of respondents, 50% of people that walk in and can be your juror, did not know how to define speculate. 25% did not know how to define burden of proof. And 50% defined preponderance of evidence as careful consideration or pondering of the evidence. And they will go and decide in a jury of peers, right? So we need to address this. In California, they did some rewriting, and preponderance of evidence ended up coming out as more likely than not, which we may agree or not, but things like, there was another phrase that was, misrecollection is not uncommon. And so they translated it into, people sometimes forget things. So this is in the context of a wide spectrum of literacy. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, runs a literacy survey in developed countries. They've been doing this since the 90s, I believe. The latest is moving a little bit away from the word literacy, but it's still about competencies and skills. And in the United States, we see 50% of the population above the zero, 50% of the population below the zero. That means the zero marks low level inference capacity when reading. So 50% of our population cannot pass this. So we want to write to them, but we also want to write to the 50% above. So that's when versioning is very important, because we want to be clear to the ones who have difficulties understanding, but we also want to be clear to the ones that are asking us for more. One of the test questions is they show people these labels of food with information, and they ask them to figure out which one was packaged first, 10% of adults in the US simply cannot do that. 20% have difficulty. And 30%, the other 20% can just do this, and they cannot go beyond this. And this has implications for lots of things. And again, science and technology in this day and age. Research from the National Science Foundation, Pew Research, the Institute for Biotechnology Information show things like adults do not understand. 25% are not aware that the Earth orbits the sun yearly. They do not know how science works, and then that leads them to say astrology is a scientific discipline. Again, this is in the context of jurors having to evaluate DNA evidence and all kinds of technical and scientific evidence to decide people's fates, right? Policy making. Our policymakers, our congressmen and senators, they usually don't read the papers that scientists write. Scientists don't read the papers that scientists write. So they go to the press. And a study, I think it's the NCBI that ran this study, or is quoted by them, 66% of reporters do not know how to interpret scientific reporters do not know how to interpret scientific papers. So we're compounding a problem. Major bills have scientific and technological components, and so we need to interpret. So we need to help them. The aspect of science, to me, is incredibly important. Scientists need to talk to one another for interdisciplinary research, for progress. And now we're in this era of publish and perish. We publish so much, so unnecessarily. Relevance. We need to reel back and look at relevance. And one of the situations that was found out is that scientists write papers, right? And then supposedly other scientists read them and they cite them, they use them. Well, if the New York Times, which has the 44% of reporters that do know how to interpret scientific information, covers your article, you will have 73% more citations. So if it was digested first by a layperson who understands, it will be out in the scientific community. If not, it will be buried in the haystack of scientific papers. So we want to have access to this information, and also we as taxpayers, because a lot of the scientific information is coming from universities that are funded by us. So do we push? We push for this. We tell scientists, we tell policymakers. Do we know it works? Yes, we do. Already studies show that plain language works. This is an image from the Plain Language Foundation in Australia, but organizations everywhere are running different surveys, and they show that it increases customer satisfaction, they show that it increases safety, that it stops wasteful resources. People are not calling in and asking for clarifications. They are responding. The IRS had a plain language translation that has have them increase revenues because people were simply not understanding that there was a correction that they were proposing. The IRS sent a letter proposing to people, and so people were a little skeptical about the proposal. So they changed the language. It increases access, it increases compliance. The FDA tracked this change, and many of you may recall drug labels that were the chunky, I don't want you to really learn about me drug label. And now they're more accessible. Can everybody figure out the dose if they're going from a junior ibuprofen to an adult ibuprofen? That's another aspect, but at least they can tell how much of it is in there. And this is a personal favorite. if you're thinking about, plain language for legal, plain language for EULAs, for terms and conditions, the end user license agreements, the Simple EULA project is helping organizations do that. Lawyers are not happy, so they still have the long versions. This is from 500 Pics, a photo posting website, and they have the long version, and then they say, basically, you cannot use your site to post pornographic material, harass people, send spam or other crazy stuff. Be reasonable and responsible. Don't do anything stupid, and you'll be fine. So that one I can read, I can understand, and I know that there will be consequences if I do any of that stuff. I'm not clicking away like, oh, okay, I have to click here because read all the, yeah, you can put me in a capsule to Mars and I won't know because. So where is all where this began? One of the iconic figures of plain language is Chrissy Mayer, a woman that started the plain language campaign in the UK. She was half-schooled, poor, but an avid reader, and she wanted to help her community access benefits. She created a publication that didn't gain her that much traction, so she decided to shred government jargon in front of the Big Ben. And the legend has it that a policeman approached her and read literally the riot act to her, which usually means that, by the riot act you have to leave, you cannot, do these things in public. But he actually read it and it was gobbledygook, and she said, does this gobbledygook mean I have to go? And people were amused and interested, and she ended up founding the Plain English campaign, which is one of the leading providers of plain language services. One of their early successes was for British Aerospace, which doesn't exist as an entity anymore, but it's very illustrative. They redrafted a contract for them that went from 150 pages to 50 pages. So that was much quicker to read. That in turn helped them close the first lease in less than a month instead of 6 months. So British Aerospace said, oh, this works because now I will have $180 million for this contract, 5 months longer in my bank account. Imagine the interest. So now they help organizations do this, and they stamp a crystal mark on their documents. My own personal hero is Bess Marson. She was a former Miss America. And women in the room, do your hair? She was a former Miss America. And she went on to become a consumer advocate. She was hired in New York for a decorative position at the time that she took to heart, and she actually went around the country, and she was Jewish, and she saw a lot of discrimination, so she became more and more aware of the need for consumer advocacy, and she ended up being hired as a consultant by Citibank, back then First National Citibank, to help them because they were bleeding money out of promissory notes that people were not paying, and the promissory notes were this. I will read just a little bit. No failure or delay on the part of the bank in exercising, and no failure to file or otherwise enforce the bank's security interest in or with respect to. So people kind of found a wall and walked away. She said, okay, this means you can delay enforcing any of your rights under this note without losing them. Oh, that I can understand. So I can pay, I can delay my payment, and I still have a right. So she became a figure of plain language. Before her, and I believe she had picked up the book, two sort of unlikely heroes were an employee from the Bureau of Land Management. John O'Hare in 1966 wrote a book saying gobbledygook has got to go, trying to get people to write more clearly. And the person who, I don't know if he coined it, but he was the first one to use in written communication gobbledygook as a word was Maury Maverick. And in a memorandum that this you can find in National Archives, he said this, and this is so relevant. Memoranda should be short as clearness will allow. The naval officer who wired cited sub, sank same, told the whole story. Put the real subject matter, the point, and even the conclusion in the opening paragraph, and the whole story on one page, period. If a lengthy explanation, statistical matter, or such is necessary, add attachments. Stay off gobbledygook language. And he was the chairman of the Smaller War Plants Corporation. That's a mouthful. He probably would have liked to change the name, but he came into it and he was stuck with it. And these were businesses that were producing things that the government needed for World War II. Of course, this is not new. We're going back in time, and King Henry V and Alphonse the Wise advocated for their version of plain language. There is also an aspect of power in this. And they went from the gobbledygook of French into English, and from Latin into English. But even in Latin, orators, who were the writers of their time, would say, write clearly. A quote from Quintilian from the first 100 years of our common era. He advised people, do not only put the reader, the listener, in a position to understand you, put him in a position to not misunderstand you. So now it became the law. In the US, we have the Plain Writing Act, and this requires agencies to write clearly. The organization that helps with this is the Plain Language Action and Information Network, and they have incredible resources. However, it's a budgetless office. What does that mean? The employees there work somewhere else for a living. So it's kind of hard. And the two heroes at plain.gov are Catherine Catania and Catherine Spivey. They work in immigration and general services, but they come together to provide services for plain language. And Kat Catania also chairs the Center for Plain Language, which is a sister organization in the US. It's a nonprofit, and they have awards, the Clear Mark Award for good work and the WTF Award. And as she would say, no, not that WTF, work that failed. And I will show you one of the Clear Mark Awards was for the University of Arkansas. They have an award in English and an award in Spanish. Plain, this is the entryway to the Plain website. Plain is one of the international organizations. The other one is Clarity, based in Canada. Plain encompasses members from 25 different countries, I believe. They just had their conference in Graz, and they track plain language projects throughout the world. These are places with official plain language initiatives. One of them is Chile. They are reworking their legal language, so there's a commission for plain language in the judicial system. There's an Institute of Plain Language in South Africa that is helping redraft laws. Mexico has, for those of you who speak Spanish, they're an excellent manual with tips about plain language writing in Spanish. The European Union is starting a lot of initiatives. One of them is the writing of clinical trial summaries in plain language for laypersons. Not the technical one that the scientists need to read, because versioning, right? We do need that technical communication, and the scientists also do like that other scientists talk nerdy to them, but we don't. So we want to know what's going on, especially with publicly funded research. The Queen of Spain has just called for plain language in a conference about linguistics and journalism. And in Northern European countries, they have the equivalent of plain.gov, but funded. So they're doing a lot of systematic work. Norway, Sweden, Finland. And some of them do also give awards. Soyons Clair is an award given by the public services in France, and they are running, Chile is running, this is from Chile, a contest about judicial writing in plain language. And some of them are the WTF kind of awards. One of them is the Foot in the Mouth Award given by the Plain Language Campaign. This year, the winner is, I won't say the name, but I will tell you what he won for. Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a titanic success of it. So we have quickly looked at a definition of plain language, strategies. The definition centers in finding, understanding, and putting to use relevant information. The reasons why we have reader difficulties and a variety of abilities and interests, and writer difficulties, jargon, and lack of logic. We want to write to the audience, addressing their needs and putting things in context. We want to write to our purpose, leading with the topic and with details that are relevant to the reader. We want to make our text organized by breaking it up into bite-sized pieces and following a logical structure. We want to write our content with grammar in mind and cohesion and coherence. We want to use design so that it's appealing with formatting and data visualization. We looked at some of our heroes, unlikely heroes, the Bureau of Land Management. A guy who headed, he had different political positions, Maverick, but he was heading a war-relating committee talking about plain language. A former Miss America, a half-school woman. It's impressive. We have, we draw inspiration from them. So we went through our cycle of heroes, and our first, for those of you writers, which I'm hoping a lot of you are, a hero story has always a first challenge and a twist. The first challenge of plain language has been to acknowledge that we need clarity, and I think the twist today is going into plain language 2.0 and acknowledging that we need versions, that we have 50% of our population below the low inference level and 50% above, and we want to access people with disabilities, we want to access people with interests that can access technical communication and scientific information, so they can be our mediators to policymakers and even to scientists for progress. So instead of saying all of these jargon, I'm going to take questions in the last few minutes, and I will be happy to stay because I don't think there's another session after. Yes. So the question, I'm going to repeat it for the recording, is how do you incite this change in writers of source text as a translator? That's a great question. By example, and again, I started this because I was translating, and I said, okay, you know what, before I translate, let me make sure I understand properly. So, sometimes you have to tread carefully, but sometimes you can go to clients and it's like, it's okay to offer help. And when you rephrase and sometimes reformat their source text, and they're like, oh, and a lot of times the writers, I work with technology a lot, and so the engineers that develop the content are really, really good at tagging and code writing, but Like, oh yeah, that sounds so much better. So by example is the first, I think the first point of entry. And then by promoting training, and there's trainers out there. I like that in this Plain Language 2.0, as I like to call it, one of the trainers in New Zealand, she presents herself as, I'm bringing sexy back to text. She will go in and first, as a first approximation, do a sample. Look at what I can do for you. So not just say, oh, you need to change this. How can you change it for the better? Does that make sense? Yes?
How can you make your case to content that is regulated by a legal and compliance team that likes convoluted and more words?
More and more words, yes. So the legal teams are a challenge, and I would go to plain.gov and look at the really cite the research to them, because they are amenable to understanding that language. And the legal community is divided. And again, in the first phase of plain language, people would have told you, do not use shall in a contract. That shall is a bad word. And now there's lawyers who are saying, look, we need to use it. There's these situations where it is appropriate. So approach them by saying, I understand you want to cover every corner, even the ones that only exist in a black hole, but we live on Earth, and sometimes Newtonian physics is okay. We want to make this accessible. It depends on your target audience. I want to help you make this accessible. And let me show you this research that shows that people actually like this. Research like the one about the jurors, and there's actually research done for judges and lawyers, presented with texts that were pre-plain language and post-plain language. And it's mind-blowing to see that, yes, they are actually, they like it. Before, they weren't told. They were like two versions. But it's like, oh no, this one, So, sometimes without the, I want to change what you do, and I don't like it and it doesn't work, is, how can I help you make this better? And the research is not widespread yet, but there's a lot of surveys and there's a lot of support that you can show to say, yes, this works. It's not just, my naive idea about writing clearly. Yes?
As translators, we all are used to adapting our texts to the context of the audience, for example. So I know myself, I will sometimes adapt the design page, but has anyone ever thought of suggesting images? Have you ever used that tactic in your, to get the message across?
Yes, absolutely. I do work, I came to translation through pharmaceutical translation, and then I went into medical localization. So, and I do a lot of patient instructions, discharge instructions after procedures in a hospital. So, and they come to me and they say, okay, we're from South America, translate for every single Spanish speaker in the US. Okay. So it's like saying, I'm going to translate for every single English speaker, the ones that prefer, that say they're going to the toilet in England, and it doesn't work. So yes, images is like, okay, I'm going to use this term that is the most used in the main target audience, but let me also add, for the example actually comes, the bathtub example comes from that, because bathtub has many different translations. So I'm going to use the one, sometimes put a second term in parentheses, but I want to make sure. Another example we were discussing in a recent project is stove, And again, many different translations. So if you have a picture of which one of the stoves in the house, the one that gives you heat in the living room, the one that you cook your food in, the one that you trolley around the house to make things warmer, which one? That one. So yes, I have, and I think that's a great technique to start talking about how to clarify content. Anybody else? And please feel free to leave. I know it's we're after time. Yes.
Just Spanish language references, how to use grammar to write plain in Spanish. When you're working in a translation that was obviously written by somebody else and has passed certain security clearances, not security, but legal clearances. It's already passed the English plain, but it still doesn't sound plain in translation.
Yes, and the translation, the techniques for plain language in your language and in English will vary. These principles will apply. The considerations of our grammar will apply. Of course, the passive may not apply in your language. The noun piling will also apply. So you want to work with the source text and work with your audience to come up with the techniques that will help that goal. And again, versioning. The technique that will help you in this project may not be the technique that you need to use in this other project. And being okay and at peace with that. Thank you guys for being here. I think I have to finish because of the recording time. And I'll be happy to hang out and stay for more questions.